At 8:12 on a wet Thursday morning, 12 consultants in identical Navy suits stood around the glass boardroom at Nexara Pay, and the only person in the room with rain on her coat was Mara Ellison, 34, the company's overlooked systems support engineer, with her 6-year-old daughter Ivy beside her clutching a stuffed dog named Bolt. When Julian Mercer, 42, the new CEO with the polished voice and silver watch, saw the child and the wrinkled cardigan and the paper cup of vending machine tea, he let the room laugh just long enough before saying they were replacing her function with actual enterprise expertise. Mara did not argue. She only bent, straightened Ivy's crooked barrette, and set Bolt more securely in the girl's arm. 4 hours later, while $186 million in live payment traffic jammed inside software none of those consultants could even parse, Julian would learn the woman he had dismissed in front of his staff had built the system they were all so proud of. Stay with this one, because the engineer they wrote off as a tired single mother was the only person standing between Nexara and a collapse nobody in that room yet knew was coming. Before we dive further, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please share it with your beloved ones and subscribe to this channel. Nexara Pay lived on the 41st through 44th floors of a glass tower in lower Manhattan and processed enough money each weekday to make most people instinctively lower their voices when they said the number out loud. On an ordinary Tuesday, it moved $3.7 billion through payroll rails, contractor disbursements, municipal reimbursements, healthcare vendor settlements, and the kind of invisible money that only mattered when it failed to arrive. There were 618 employees across New York, Austin, and Dublin, although only 203 sat in the tower full-time. The company was 6 weeks from an IPO that had already been priced in private conversations before it had been priced on paper. Bankers floated a valuation between $11.4 and $12.1 billion. The board preferred the higher number and spoke as though preference were an instrument of law. The business press liked to call Nexara boring infrastructure, which in finance was another way of saying indispensable. Small cities used it to pay sanitation crews. Rural hospital networks used it to settle pharmacy contracts. 4 regional trucking cooperatives used it because their old payroll systems kept misfiring across state tax boundaries. In one fluorescent room on the 42nd floor, a wall screen showed live settlements throughput in green bars that climbed every 4 seconds. Visitors liked that screen. Investors liked it more. It made the company look clean, inevitable, modern. Only a few people knew the screen hid a machine held together by discipline rather than glamour. The machine was called Meridian. Officially, Meridian was a proprietary reconciliation and payment orchestration platform. Index prepared for investors. It was described with the kind of vague confidence executives loved: modular, scalable, resilient, cloud-native, compliance-forward. The words stacked neatly. They did not explain very much. The truth was more specific and less decorative. Meridian was an unusual hybrid of event-driven settlement logic, batch failover pathways, custom routing tables, and a rule language so compact that most new engineers mistook it for annotations the first time they saw it. It had been written over 11 years in layers, under pressure, often at hours when nobody else was still awake. It handled bad timestamps, malformed vendor files, duplicate municipal uploads, and banking holidays that arrived with contradictory documentation. It tolerated human error because its real architect understood that human error was the one constant nobody in finance ever budgeted for honestly. That architect sat 3 floors below the executive suite, beside a filing cabinet, with a broken bottom drawer and a fern she sometimes forgot to water. Mara's desk was near the operations bullpen, although desk suggested more ownership than the space really implied. It was a gray surface under a vent that rattled in winter. She kept 2 mechanical pencils in a mug printed with a faded constellation chart, a spiral notebook full of cramped handwriting, and a lunch bag that had once been blue. Most people in the company assumed she was a legacy support employee who knew old systems because she had simply outlasted them. She dressed like someone who chose sleep over ironing, because that was often exactly what she had done. She wore her dark hair knotted at the nape of her neck, usually with a pencil or a clip or whatever, had not vanished into the geography of single parenthood. Her badge said Senior Systems Support Engineer. The title was both true and offensively incomplete. People who did not know better saw fatigue first. People who did know better saw other things. They noticed the way she could glance at a failed queue and tell whether the corruption started at the ingestion layer or 2 hops downstream in the rule compiler. They noticed she never used jargon for theater. They noticed that when she said, "Don't restart that yet," everyone who had once ignored similar advice had already learned not to repeat the mistake. Dominic Shaw, 51, the company's director of infrastructure, with a patient face and a former Marine's posture, had once told a new site reliability engineer that if Mara ever sounded uncertain, it meant the problem was real. "If she sounds calm," he had said, "you still have time." He was one of the few people in the building who had enough history to be afraid of how much he did not know about where Meridian had really come from. Madison Reeve, 27, a junior product analyst with fast eyes and a habit of taking notes by hand, had figured out something else. She had been at Nexara 8 months before she realized that every undocumented corner of Meridian seemed to resolve around Mara like filings around a magnet. The company wiki named committees, initiatives, migration phases, vendor partners, former vice presidents. It had almost nothing useful on the core rule engine. Yet on 3 separate outages, Madison had watched senior engineers hover uselessly until Mara arrived, set down her tea, read 20 lines of logs, and began asking the only questions that mattered. Nobody celebrated those moments. They were folded back into the day, as competence usually is. At 6:05 each morning, before any of that, Mara's real look began in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, above a locksmith, and across from a laundromat that never seemed to close. The kitchen window rattled in winter and stuck in August. Ivy kept crayons in an old biscuit tin and drew animals with impossible jobs. Firefighter penguins, dentist wolves, astronauts in rain boots. Bolt, the stuffed rabbit with one ear slightly lower than the other, had once been white and was now the color of old paper. Mara had sewn the rabbit twice, once along the stomach and once below the neck. Ivy believed stitches made things braver. That Thursday began badly and then became worse. The after-school program had closed early because of a burst pipe in the elementary school annex, and Mara's usual backup sitter, Mrs. Alvarez from 4B, had taken her husband to a cardiology appointment in Brooklyn. Mara had spent 12 minutes rearranging phone calls that could not be rearranged, and another 7 staring at the time. Nexara was hosting the consultants that morning for the operational transition presentation, an exercise Julian Mercer had ordered after announcing a modernization initiative that sounded efficient in the way euphemisms often do, just before people lose their jobs. Mara had meant to drop Ivy with a friend in Long Island City. Traffic on the Queensboro Bridge turned that plan into fantasy. So she brought her daughter to the office for what she told herself would be 14 minutes. Ivy wore a yellow raincoat and silver sneakers and carried Bolt under one arm with grave formality, as if he too had professional obligations. She had her father's eyes, large and observant, and Mara's stillness. In the elevator, she asked whether grown-ups got in trouble for being late. Mara had looked at the floor indicator and said, "Sometimes." Ivy had thought about that. "Do they cry?" she asked. Mara smiled without showing teeth. "The smart ones wait until they're alone." That was the line Ivy repeated, by accident, 10 minutes later outside the boardroom doors, where 2 consultants heard her and exchanged the kind of amusement people mistake for sophistication. Julian Mercer entered precisely on time, because timing was one of the ways he made power visible. He had been at Nexara for 19 weeks, recruited from a high-profile operational turnaround at a logistics firm, praised in magazines for discipline, simplification, and executive courage. He was not stupid, that was important. Stupid men were easy to dismiss. Julian was intelligent, articulate, broadly competent, and accustomed to environments where identifying redundant layers made him look visionary. He had inherited a company adored by its founder, Daniel Sloan, a brilliant operator and terrible manager who had retired after a stroke 14 months earlier. Daniel had tolerated weirdness if it worked. Julian did not like weirdness. He liked mappable structures, clean reporting lines, vendor accountability, and systems that could survive the absence of any one person, because he believed dependence itself was a managerial sin. In theory, he was right. In practice, he made one category error that would become very expensive. He mistook invisibility for replaceability. He had seen Mara's title in an org chart, her salary line in a budget review, and her name in several incident threads that were annoyingly unresolved. He had been told she was legacy glue, tribal knowledge, and a bit defensive about documentation. Grant Tolland, 46, lead partner at Verity North Consulting, had reinforced the impression. Grant was one of those men who wore expensive eyeglasses for aesthetic rather than optical reasons. He believed systems existed to justify reorganizations and people existed to narrate them. He had assured Julian that whatever the support engineer did could be captured, translated, and absorbed by a specialized team. He had brought 12 consultants because large headcounts made clients feel safer. They were still feeling safe when Julian saw Mara near the boardroom with a child. He paused for half a second. That half second decided the day. "What is this?" he asked, not loudly, which somehow made it worse. Mara rose from the chair where Ivy had been drawing on the back of a printed agenda. "School issue," she said. "I'm arranging pickup. She'll be gone before the presentation starts." Julian's eyes moved from the yellow raincoat to the wrinkled cuff of Mara's cardigan to the consultants already watching. He smiled the brief, bloodless smile of a man who has found a symbol useful to him. "No," he said. "Actually, this is helpful." Nobody in the hallway spoke. "Helpful?" Mara asked. "We're talking today about operational maturity," Julian said, "about reducing improvisation, about building a company investors can trust to scale, and you've just illustrated the problem more clearly than any slide could." A few people gave the small, involuntary laughs of subordinates, sensing the shape of an executive mood. Grant Tolland did not laugh involuntarily. He enjoyed himself openly. Ivy looked up from her drawing. Children always know when tone changes. Julian clasped his hands. "Your role is being transitioned effective immediately. Verity North will absorb support mapping and systems interpretation. HR will formalize details by noon. You don't need to attend." It took Dominic Shaw 2 steps to reach the hall from the bullpen. But by then the moment had hardened. Mara did not plead. She did not defend herself. She did not explain that she had been awake since 4:11 because Ivy had a cough and because a settlement variance in Ohio had needed triage at 2:03. She bent instead, took the pink barrette sliding from Ivy's hair, fixed it with gentle precision, and lifted the child's backpack from the floor. "Okay," she said. Grant Tolland glanced at the notebook in Mara's hand. "We'll need any materials relevant to your support function." She handed him the notebook. He took it too quickly, the way people take things from those they believe cannot afford refusal. Dominic opened his mouth. Mara gave the smallest shake of her head. It was so slight, most people missed it. He did not. Ivy looked from Julian to her mother. "Did you make a bad mess?" she asked in the clear voice of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned how adults decorate cruelty. The silence that followed was longer than Julian intended. He shifted. "No one made a mess," he said. Mara lifted Bolt from the chair, placed the rabbit in Ivy's arms, and led her to the elevator without another word. The door closed on the consultants, the laughter, the polished shoes, the mirrored wall panels reflecting everyone back at themselves. On the back of the printed agenda Ivy had been drawing, she had written in careful block letters, "Mom fixes hard things." Madison Reeve found that paper 15 minutes later under a chair. She folded it once and put it in her notebook instead of the recycling. By 9:40, Verity North had occupied the war room like a military that had mistaken a map for territory. They spread laptops, requested repositories, asked for architecture documents, requested dependency graphs, and complained about naming conventions, inside code they had only just accessed. Grant stood at the front screen with a laser pointer and used phrases like knowledge extraction and single-threaded human bottlenecks. Julian approved of the tone. It sounded like progress. They would document Meridian, isolate its human dependencies, and assign a layered support model before the roadshow. That was the plan. Plans comfort people who have not yet met reality. The first sign of trouble came from a queue monitor on the 42nd floor wall, a yellow warning where green usually lived. One municipal reimbursement batch from Western Pennsylvania had entered a deferral loop, not catastrophic. Meridian deferred things all the time, but the warning persisted past its usual clearance window. A consultant named Priya frowned and said the parser was rejecting an exception map for reasons she couldn't identify. Grant told her to force a reload. Dominic, hearing that from across the room, looked up too sharply. "Don't reload live deferrals," he said. Grant barely turned. "We're fine." Dominic took 2 more steps. "No, you're not. Those queues are stateful across reconciliation windows." Grant smiled at the room. "That's exactly the kind of undocumented folklore we're here to replace." He authorized the reload. For 23 seconds, nothing happened. Then the yellow warning became 3 red ones. Meridian did not crash. If it had crashed, the problem would have been visible sooner. Meridian did something worse. It continued running while silently duplicating a subset of deferred validation requests into a shadow hold state. The throughput bar remained mostly green. Money still moved, but beneath the visible lanes, exception traffic began stacking in a chamber few people in the company even knew existed. Dominic knew because he had seen it once during a banking holiday collision in 2019. Mara had fixed it in 14 minutes and never explained how she knew where to look. By 10:17, there were 38,412 unresolved items in the hold state. By 10:31, Grant had stopped smiling. Madison stood at the back of the war room, taking notes nobody had asked her to take. She watched consultants open files with names like Meridian Raise A7 Mimser Railmap Cockimser, Windowed Ledger Minj, and Mimset Fallback. They read quickly, the way smart people do when they expect the structure beneath unfamiliar material to resemble something they already understand. After 10 minutes, their pace changed. The code did not behave as they expected. The rule language was dense, almost musical in its compression. Whole exception classes were handled in strings of symbols and terse declarations that looked, at first glance, like shorthand. It was not shorthand. It was architecture, a compact grammar, a different way of thinking. "Where's the language spec?" one of them asked. "There isn't one in the repository," another said. "What kind of person writes comments like this?" On the screen was a single line above a merge gate. "Never restart a ledger you have not named." Madison wrote it down because it felt less like a comment than a warning left by someone who expected not to be listened to. At 11:05, Dominic went downstairs to Mara's desk. HR had already cleared it with bureaucratic speed. Her mug was gone. The fern remained. A yellow sticky note had been left on the monitor by someone in facilities. Asset pending reassignment. Dominic stared at the empty chair long enough to feel something close to shame. He had not defended her. He told himself there had been no opening, that any intervention would have made it worse, that she had asked for silence with that tiny shake of the head. All of that was true, and none of it absolved him. In the top drawer, he found nothing but 2 paper clips and a cough drop wrapper. In the second drawer, he found a laminated card with emergency contacts, 1 granola bar, and a folded index card covered in Ivy's handwriting. It read, "If work is mean, come home and I will share my crackers." He sat down in Mara's chair and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. At 11:42, Julian Mercer finally understood the problem was not narrative. The payment hold state had crossed 91,000 items, and Treasury partners were beginning to ask why settlement acknowledgments were lagging by 13 minutes. 13 minutes in consumer software meant almost nothing. 13 minutes in payment infrastructure, 6 weeks before an IPO, meant phones started ringing on floors where assistants never laughed. Julian entered the war room, expecting confusion he could discipline into order. Instead, he found 12 expensive people speaking over one another, while Dominic stared at a terminal with the expression of a man watching weather. Move wrong. What do you need? Julian asked. Grant answered too quickly. We need time. How much? Grant hesitated. Unknown. Julian turned to Dominic. How much? Dominic did not look at him. If Mara were here, 30 minutes, maybe less. The room changed shape around the name. Julian's jaw tightened. Then, call her. She's not on call anymore, Dominic said. Call her anyway. Dominic did. The call went to voicemail. At 12:08 in Queens, Mara sat across from Ivy in a diner with a cracked sugar dispenser and a counterman, who called everyone's sweetheart. She had taken the long route home instead of the fast one because she needed the extra 6 minutes to decide what to say to her daughter. Her severance paperwork had arrived by email before her soup. Human resources moved with the serenity of systems that never had to look anyone in the eye. Ivy ate grilled cheese in neat bites and lined Bolt's paws against the edge of the table, as if the rabbit also intended to be polite. Are you sick from work? Ivy asked. No. Then why are we eating lunch when the sun is still up? Mara stirred tea that did not need stirring. My job changed. Ivy considered this with real seriousness, like when caterpillars do. Not exactly. Did the shiny man fire you? Marga's hand paused on the spoon. She rarely lied to children, especially her own. Yes, Ivy's mouth became a small line. Because of me? No. Mara's answer came fast and flat enough that even the counterman glanced over. She softened it. No, baby, not because of you. Then why did he talk like you were bad? Mara looked at the rain sliding down the diner window. Across the street, a delivery driver lifted boxes from a truck one at a time, with the care of someone who knew what a dropped thing cost. Sometimes people decide what something is before they understand it, she said. Ivy fed a crust to Bolt. That's dumb. A sound left Mara that might have become a laugh under better circumstances. Sometimes, she said. Yes. Her phone vibrated 3 times. Dominic. Dominic again. Unknown internal line. She placed it face down. Ivy touched the back of her hand. You can be sad, she said. I won't tell. That nearly did it. Not the firing. Not the hallway laughter, that. Mara looked at her daughter and saw the terrible mercy of children. How they offer what little they have as if it were sufficient because love has not yet taught them scale. I know, she said. At 12:26, Dominic called from his own number again. This time Mara answered. He did not waste language. They forced a live reload on the deferral layer, hold states multiplying through the shadow ledger. Mara closed her eyes. Can they see it? She asked. Barely. They don't understand the rule grammar. How high? 123,000. Mara looked at Ivy. Bolt was now sitting upright against the ketchup bottle. Did they touch the merge salts? Silence, then Dominic said more quietly. I don't know. That was answer enough. Julian took the phone from Dominic because men like him often believed presence could substitute for history. Mara, he said, with practiced control. We have an operational issue. I'm asking you to come in and assist. Mara did not respond immediately. In the diner, a dishwasher tray clattered in the back. Ivy hummed to Bolt. Assist, Mara said at last. Julian heard the word he had chosen and, for the first time that day, recognized its weight. Help resolve it, he corrected. What changed before the cue duplicated? He looked to Grant, who began an explanation full of verbs and nothing useful. Mara interrupted after 7 seconds. Did anyone reload a live deferral queue without freezing replay? Julian did not answer. That means yes, Mara said. Did anyone open the West Pennsylvania Municipal Exception Pack? Another silence. Julian, yes. And did anyone rename merge salts in the config to match the documentation set? Grant said. The labels were opaque. Mara stood so abruptly her tea sloshed. Don't touch anything else, she said. Do not restart Meridian. Do not reindex the hold state. If anyone suggests failover, remove them from the keyboard. Julian exhaled. How long until you can get here? Mara looked at Ivy. At the half sandwich, at Bolt, at the school issue day that had already become the hinge of something larger. 48 minutes, she said. I need to drop my daughter somewhere safe. We'll send a car. No, the word was quiet, absolute. You've done enough moving people around for one day. She hung up. Mrs. Alvarez was home by 12:41 and took one look at Mara's face before opening her apartment door wider. She smelled like coffee and eucalyptus rub. Her husband slept in the recliner with a blanket over his knees. Ivy knew the place well enough to remove her shoes without being asked. She held Bolt by one ear and watched her mother kneel. "I have to go fix something," Mara said. Ivy nodded as if this had been expected all along. "At the giant building?" "Yes, because they broke it." Mara brushed a crumb from the child's chin. "Yes. Will the shiny mans still be there?" "Yes." Ivy considered. "Okay." Then, after a moment, "Don't be little." Mara's face altered by a fraction. "I'll try." Ivy pressed Bolt into her hands, for one solemn second, a blessing or a loan, then took him back. "He says don't let wrong people push the buttons." Mrs. Alvarez, listening from the kitchen, turned away to hide her eyes. Rain had thickened into the kind that blurred headlights and made Manhattan look farther away than it was. In the car service Julian had insisted on, and Mara had refused, then eventually accepted only because Dominic bypassed him and sent it without commentary. She opened her phone and began writing instructions into a note she might never need to send. Freeze replay before inspection. Validate salt tables against last clean hash. Check West Pa Muni packet for label normalization. Search merge logs for synthetic alias. North. The note grew, line by line, with a precision so practiced it felt less like invention than memory re-entering the room. She knew meridian the way pianists know scales, through repetition so complete it becomes body rather than thought. She also knew something else. If the consultants had touched merge salts, they had not merely made a local error, they had broken one of the old safeties, the ones buried so early in Meridian's architecture that later engineers mistook them for quirks. Mara had built those safeties during year 2, after a state payroll client accidentally uploaded the same file 3 times with 3 timestamp formats and a corrupted delimiter. Everyone had panicked. Mara had stayed until 3:14 a.m., written a workaround, and then another, until the system could tell the difference between repeated instructions and repeated accidents. Daniel Sloan, the founder, had brought her vending machine coffee and asked what the new layer should be called. She had said, "A lock." He had laughed. "Everything in here sounds like a prison when you name it." She had named it Salt Gate because she was too tired to be poetic. Daniel had known what she was. He had paid her badly for the first 2 years anyway, which was one of the great banalities of talent. But he had known, when Mara first came to Nexara, it had not even been Nexara. It had been Harbor Ledger, 3 floors above a parking garage, 9 employees, 1 sickly ficus, and an idea bigger than its wiring. Mara was 23, newly married, half finished with a computer science degree she could no longer afford after her father's stroke, and a stack of medical debt that ate the future. Before it arrived, she had been temping nights, writing code for whomever paid fastest, and fixing a database corruption issue at a regional equipment supplier. When someone mentioned a startup whose payment engine was bleeding exceptions, it could not explain. Mara took a bus to Manhattan in borrowed shoes and spent 14 unpaid hours tracing malformed ACH returns through a prototype so fragile she was afraid to breathe near it. At dawn she handed Daniel Sloan a legal pad covered front and back and said, "Your architecture isn't wrong, your assumptions are." He hired her before breakfast. No one in the modern investor decks mentioned that. The official mythology of Nexara began with Daniel, venture capital, and market timing. Mara had been written out gradually, first by omission, then by title compression, then by the ordinary laziness of institutions that mistake storytelling for truth. When Daniel renamed Harbor Ledger to Nexara Pay after Series B, lawyers moved code ownership under the company. Mara signed everything because she needed health insurance, and because her husband, Ben Ellison, a paramedic with laugh lines and large hands, had just begun chemotherapy. By the time Ben died 4 years later, Meridian was already everywhere inside the business, and Mara no longer had energy left for anything except work, survival, and the small gravity of the child sleeping in the next room. She never corrected the mythology. She did not have the vanity for it, or perhaps she was simply tired. At 1:19, Mara re-entered Nexara with rain in the hem of her trousers and a borrowed visitor badge because her own had already been disabled. The lobby guard straightened in a way that suggested word had traveled faster than elevators. She nodded once and went upstairs. The operations bullpen looked as if someone had opened a machine and discovered too late that it had springs. People were moving quickly but not well. Tension had contagious. On the wall, live throughput still displayed green enough to deceive casual eyes. Mara did not look at the wall. She looked at faces. Dominic's tight jaw. Madison's notebook opened to 3 pages of cramped writing. Priya from Verity North, holding herself with the brittle stillness of someone smart enough to know she was in over her head. Julian came toward her near the war room doors. His suit jacket was off now. The omission humanized him and made no difference. "Thank you for coming," he said. Mara met his eyes for exactly the length required to acknowledge speech. "Who touched the merge salts?" Grant answered, already defensive. The naming was inconsistent across environments. "We normalized labels to match the current documentation." "There is no current documentation," Mara said. "There is now." She looked at him as one might look at an appliance giving off smoke. "No, now there is damage." Julian stepped aside. It was the first correct decision he had made around her all day. Inside the war room, 12 consultants turned with the discomfort of people who had built a theory around someone and now had to watch that someone become useful. Mara set her bag down, pulled a chair in front of the central terminal, and asked for the last clean hash window. No one moved quickly enough. Dominic was already typing before the request finished landing. She scanned the logs, eyes moving in small decisive jumps. On the screen, alias chains braided through replay windows and synthetic labels. There it was, Northethel, a temporary alias she had written 8 years earlier during a migration weekend, and never fully removed because the old bank endpoint still pinged it under specific holiday conditions. The consultants had seen it, assumed it was leftover clutter, and collapsed it into a normalized label group with live salts. Meridian had interpreted the change as instruction drift and duplicated hold state preservation rather than risking false deletion. It had protected money by sacrificing speed. Mara exhaled once through her nose. "Good," she said. Grant blinked. "Good? It means Meridian did what it was built to do." Priya, despite everything, leaned forward. "Can you unwind it?" "Yes." "How long?" 27 minutes if nobody interrupts me." Nobody interrupted her. She worked the way certain surgeons work, with very little visible motion. Command line, log pull, hash comparison, replay freeze, shadow ledger inspection. She asked Dominic for the archived salt table from A3 and Madison for the handwritten change notes from the consultant access meeting. Because the repository audit would lag, Madison had them. Of course she had them. Mara verified the duplicate hold path, isolated the synthetic alias, and wrote a temporary remap script directly in the terminal, rather than trusting any existing tool. Grant moved once, as if to question her approach. Julian stopped him with a hand. The room became quiet enough to hear the wall vent. On the main screen, a red bar paused, then began to recede. At 1:41, Treasury latency dropped from 19 minutes to 11. At 1:46, the first held municipal packets re-entered clean settlement order. At 1:49, a consultant whispered, "What language is that?" Madison answered without looking away from the screen. "Hers." No one corrected her. Mara continued. She explained almost nothing, but the little she did say cut through the room with humiliating clarity. You can't force a replay across unresolved exception memory. A minute later, this parser doesn't trust labels. It trusts behavior, later still. If the system protects money by looking irrational to you, assume you are the one behind. There was no performance in it, no revenge. She was speaking the way mechanics speak to stripped bolts and firefighters speak in smoke, with emphasis reserved for necessity. At 2:03, Meridian's hold state fell below 10,000. At 2:07, the green bars on the wall screen looked honest again. Nobody applauded. Real fear leaves a residue applause cannot clean. Julian Mercer stood at the back of the room with the posture of a man discovering the dimensions of his own mistake in real time. He had hired Grant Tolland because Grant gave him a vocabulary for control. He had believed replacing one tired support engineer with 12 branded experts would signal maturity to the market. He had not asked why every old incident thread ended when Mara entered it. He had not asked why Daniel Sloan, before retiring, had written in a board memo that Meridian is stable because the right person still watches it. He had assumed the right person was a process. At 2:16, the final deferred packet cleared. Mara leaned back for the first time in nearly an hour. "You need to leave the alias in place," she said. "Document it this time. Flag holiday behavior collisions on old bank endpoints. Rebuild your label guide from actual runtime patterns, not whatever deck you were given." Grant swallowed. "We can do that." Mara looked at him. "No," she said. "You can watch while someone who understands it starts." The tables had turned before, in boardrooms and courtrooms and auction houses and garages. In stories executives liked to tell about merit, but real turning was rarely theatrical. It sounded like a woman in a damp cardigan telling 12 consultants to stop touching what they did not understand. The full truth emerged each 20 minutes later, because crises have a way of knocking loose whatever institutions have packed away. Madison, sent to retrieve archived onboarding materials from a locked records cabinet, found a black binder dated 11 years earlier. Harbor Ledger Core Recovery. Taped inside the front cover was an envelope in Daniel Sloan's unmistakable slanted handwriting. For Meridian failure beyond tier documentation, call Mara Ellison before anyone else. She wrote the rule engine. If she says do not restart, do not restart. Madison brought it first to Dominic, who read it twice and shut his eyes hard enough to hurt, then to Julian. There are moments when power leaves a face faster than expression can keep up. This was one. Julian took the envelope, then the binder, then the attached architecture origin sheet bearing an old vendor line. Core logic authored under contract by M. Ellison, integrated in full, retained for continuity. Below that, in Daniel's hand again. Nobody else reads this thing all the way down. Julian turned a page and found annotated grammar notes. He turned another and found version lineage mapping directly to Mara's employee ID from years before her current title existed. He found a memo from legal requesting simplification of role descriptions for compensation harmonization after Series C. He found the early architecture of a theft so administrative nobody had likely named it that way. Not theft of code. The company owned the code. Something smaller and uglier. Theft of authorship by compression. Theft of visibility by title. Theft of the right to be seen accurately by the institution built on your labor. Grant tried to recover ground with language. "This doesn't change the need for proper externalization." Julian cut him off without looking up. "Be quiet." It was the first useful sentence Grant had provoked all day. But Meridian was not done humiliating them yet. At 2:54, as if to insist on the lesson, an external clearing partner flagged a checksum mismatch on a cluster of vendor settlements that had entered during the hold state duplication window. The money had not been lost. It had been quarantined. If not resolved by 4 p.m., 312 healthcare vendor payments across 3 states would miss the day's release. And one of those healthcare networks was scheduled to speak with analysts the following morning about its own cost control program, powered by Nexara. The damage would no longer be hidden inside systems. It would become narrative. Markets loved narrative when it bled. Mara had already stood to leave. Dominic looked at the new alert, then at her. "Can you yes?" she said. Because the answer was yes. And because patients in hospitals did not care who had been rude in hallways. The second crisis required a different kind of competence, not repair, reconstruction. The duplicated hold state had altered checksum sequencing on one packet family, meaning external partner validation no longer matched the original outbound signature order. Consultants proposed resending the batch. Mara rejected it immediately. You resend, and you risk duplicate payout on late acknowledgement. That's how headlines get written. She requested raw packet traces, the pre-normalization salt table, and the archived sequence seed used for that partner's legacy gateway. Priya, to her credit, found the seed faster than anyone else. Mara noticed. "Thank you," she said, and Priya straightened like someone handed back a part of herself. Julian watched Mara assemble a repair window the way a physicist might watch someone rederive an equation everybody else had been quoting incorrectly for years. She identified the sequence drift at packet 8311, wrote a corrective map that re-signed only quarantined items without touching acknowledged ones, and built a one-time checksum bridge so the clearing partner would accept the adjusted order as continuity rather than replacement. It was elegant in the severe way emergency engineering sometimes becomes when performed by someone who has no interest in being admired. At 3:37, the healthcare vendor cluster cleared. At 3:44, the partner acknowledgement returned clean. At 3:48, the war room exhaled as one organism. Nobody looked at Grant anymore. The climax, when it came, arrived not in the war room, but in the all-hands meeting Julian called at 4:30. He could have handled it privately. That would have been tidier. He understood at last that tidiness was part of the problem. Employees packed the largest conference space and overflowed into the hall. People knew enough to know something had happened. Rumor in a company moves faster than settlement traffic and with fewer controls. Mara stood near the sidewall, not the front, one hand on the strap of her bag. Her hair had begun to frizz from the rain. She looked like a tired woman who wanted to go home to her daughter. She did not look like the person who had just saved the company from a self-inflicted operational wound large enough to delay a public offering and crater confidence. That was how the day had started. With appearances, Julian, to his credit, did not hide behind them again. He walked to the microphone without notes. "This morning," he said, "I made a decision publicly and handled it badly. I judged a person's value with incomplete information and too much confidence. That mistake nearly cost this company more than money." The room stilled. He looked directly at Mara. Mara Ellison built the core rule architecture behind Meridian. Many of the systems we rely on every day exist because of her work. I did not know that when I dismissed her role this morning, and I should have. I am responsible for not knowing it. I am also responsible for the disrespect of how I acted. I was wrong. No corporate vocabulary softened it. No one missed the rarity of that. Julian went on, though the harder part was still ahead. Verity North's transition work is suspended effective immediately. An internal review of role classification, documentation practice, and authorship attribution begins today. If anyone here has been made small by the way this company explains its own success, that will be examined too. There was no applause at first because people did not trust what they were hearing. Then a few hands started. Then more. Mara did not move except to shift her weight once. Julian stepped away from the microphone and crossed to her in full view of the company. "I'm sorry," he said, low enough that only those nearest heard the first sentence and then louder, because some things should be heard. "I humiliated you in front of your child and your colleagues. There isn't a management phrase that fixes that. I'm sorry." Mara regarded him with the same expression she had given terminals, queues, outages, weather, assessment without theater. Finally, she said, "You asked the right questions eventually." A breath of uneasy laughter moved through the room and vanished. "That counts," she added. It was not absolution. It was worse and kinder than that. It left him responsible for what came next. Julian swallowed. What would you require to stay, not return? Even now the language betrayed ownership. Mara thought about Ivy and Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, probably coloring bolt blue for no reason except that children refuse the tyranny of realism. She thought about years of invisible labor. She thought about Daniel Sloane's binder and the long administrative erosion of being translated downward until everyone forgot the height from which the work had come. She thought about the junior engineers who watched people like her and learned, quietly, what institution rewarded and what they merely consumed. Then she answered, "First, no one gets escorted out in front of their child again." Julian nodded once. "Second, Meridian gets documented by the people who actually understand runtime behavior, and that work counts toward promotion. Not housekeeping, promotion." Another nod. "Third, Madison Reeve joins the architecture review. She listens." Madison, in the third row, startled so visibly that Dominic almost smiled. "Fourth," Mara said, And now the room understood she had been doing this work long enough to know the shape of leverage. Support is not a dumping ground for people carrying the company's memory. Reclassify the team. Pay them accordingly. Julian did not hesitate. Done. She adjusted the strap on her bag. Then I'll consider consulting terms while I decide the rest. It was the closest thing to triumph the room would get, and even that belonged more to structure than ego. After the meeting, people approached her in careful clusters. Some wanted to apologize for silence. Some wanted to thank her. Some wanted proximity to competence now that competence had become visible. Mara received all of it with the same measured civility. Priya from Verity North came last. For what it's worth, she said. I knew 10 minutes in that we weren't reading a mess. We were reading design. Mara nodded. That is worth something. Dominic walked her to the elevator. In the reflection of the closing doors, the building looked the same. Glass, chrome, light arranged to flatter itself. But institutions do not remain entirely untouched by the truth once it has crossed a microphone. I should have said something this morning, Dominic said. You did? Mara said. He frowned. You listened when it mattered. He looked at her for a second, then accepted the mercy because refusing it would only make the moment about him. When she finally reached Queens, the sky had cleared into that bruised lavender color cities get on evenings after hard rain misses. Alvarez sent Ivy back across the hall in sock feet and an oversized t-shirt with a dolphin on it. The child ran down the corridor with Bolt under one arm and stopped just short of collision because Mara had taught her about momentum. Did you fix it? She asked before hello. Mara unlocked the apartment. Yes. Did the shiny man know you're the builder? Mara set down her bag. He does now. Ivy nodded with deep satisfaction, as if the universe had merely corrected an administrative oversight. I told Bolt. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of cumin from Mrs. Alvarez's dinner, and the laundry soap from the clean towels Mara had forgotten to fold. She changed into softer clothes while Ivy narrated the crucial events of the afternoon, which included 2 crackers, 1 cartoon dog, and a disagreement with Mrs. Alvarez's cat regarding rabbit boundaries. At 7:18 they ate scrambled eggs on toast because neither of them had energy for ambition. Mara signed a school form, found a missing sneaker under the couch, and put a casserole dish back into a tote bag to return next door. The ordinary work of life resumed with its stubborn dignity, as if billion-dollar consequences elsewhere had no authority over the sink. Later, when Ivy was in bed under the faded quilt Ben's mother had sewn before she died, the child held Bolt by the patched stomach and stared toward the hallway light. Mom? Yes. Why didn't you yell at him? Mara leaned against the doorframe. Of all the questions in the day, this one had waited until there was no one left to impress. Because yelling wasn't the part that needed doing. Ivy absorbed that. Will he be nicer now? Maybe. Do you want him to be sorry forever? Mara thought of Julian at the microphone, stripped for 1 clean minute of management language, and forced into the plain syntax of remorse. She thought of how rarely power learns without losing something first. No, she said, just accurate. Ivy hugged Bolt. Okay. Then, in the sleepy voice children use when truth arrives before grammar, she said, he thought you were little because you looked tired. Mara looked down at her daughter's face in the half-light. Maybe, but you're not little. You're just carrying too much. There it was again. The plain, devastating line only a child could say without knowing it would remain in someone for years. After Ivy slept, Mara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and an email from Julian Mercer waiting unread in her inbox. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she unfolded the paper Madison had slipped into her bag after the all-hands. The crayon drawing Ivy had made on the printed agenda. Mom fixes hard things. Someone had smoothed the creases carefully. Mara placed the drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a strawberry. Then she opened the email. It was brief. No strategy. No legal hedging. An apology written in plain sentences. Proposed consulting terms attached. Authority over architecture review. Immediate compensation correction. Documentation initiative. Support team reclassification. An optional public correction to investor materials, acknowledging origin authorship if she wanted it. She read the message once, then again. She noticed where it was clumsy and where it was honest. She typed a response with 3 edits to the attached terms, one additional condition about remote flexibility on school days, and a final line: "I'm available tomorrow at 9:30. Do not let anyone rename anything overnight." Julian replied in under 4 minutes. Understood. Over the next 6 weeks, Nexara changed in ways large companies usually swear are impossible until embarrassment makes them efficient. Support titles were rebuilt, salaries adjusted. Incident reviews began including authorship trails and runtime knowledge instead of only process maps. Madison joined architecture sessions and asked the kind of questions that prevented vanity from dressing itself as rigor. Priya left Verity North 2 months later and took a role at a smaller infrastructure firm where, rumors said, people were allowed to learn before presenting. Grant Tolland wrote a defensive internal memo no one outside his partnership ever needed to remember. Julian Mercer changed too, though not into a saint. Men like him rarely become saints. He became more careful, less certain in public when certainty was unearned. He stopped treating elegant diagrams as proof. He asked engineers to explain failure paths before asking bankers to explain upside. Once, during a leadership review, someone referred to Mara as legacy support, and Julian corrected the phrase so sharply the room went cold. Progress in institutions often looks like that first, not redemption. Precision. As for Mara, she did not take the office Julian offered on the 43rd floor with the river view and the expensive chair. She kept a smaller corner room near operations 3 days a week and worked from Queens the other 2, where Ivy sometimes drew beside her with Bolt supervising. She accepted a new title only after reading it twice: Principal Systems Architect. Accurate enough. She asked that her old mug be returned from storage. It was. The firm came too surprisingly alive. The IPO happened on schedule, though the valuation settled lower than the board had hoped at $10.8 billion. Mara did not care. On listing day, cameras crowded the lobby, and Julian rang the ceremonial bell with directors and bankers and the polished choreography of public success. Mara watched the livestream later from home while helping Ivy cut apple slices. The child asked whether the bell was important. Mara said, "To some people." Ivy held up Bolt to the screen as if allowing the rabbit to inspect it. "He thinks your computer was more important." "So do I," Mara said. Winter came, then a brittle clean spring one evening in March, nearly 9 months after the Thursday with the rain and the hallway laughter. Mara came home to find Ivy sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, arranging crayons into color families only a child would recognize. Bolt wore a paper badge clipped to his chest. "He works with you now," Ivy explained. "Oh?" "He tells people not to push buttons when they're showing off." Mara set down groceries and finally laughed without guarding the sound. In the kitchen, while soup warmed and the radiator ticked like something old deciding to continue, Ivy brought over a school assignment. Draw someone who builds your world. She had drawn Mara with wild inaccurate height and very tired eyes and hands too large for proportion. Beside her, in block letters, Ivy had written, "My mom makes sure important things get where they need to go. She looks sleepy because she is doing more than one job. She fixes mistakes without being mean. She is the builder even when people forget." Mara read it twice. Then she folded the page with immense care and placed it in the drawer where important documents lived: passports, lease papers, Ben's last letter, the original hospital bracelet from the day Ivy was born. Some truths deserved that drawer more than contracts ever had. Later that night, after the dishes and bath time, and one extra story because Wednesday had been long, Ivy fell asleep with Bolt under her chin and one hand open against the blanket. Mara stood in the doorway for a minute longer than necessary, as parents do when love has no productive place left to go. Through the thin apartment wall came the muffled television from next door. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted. The city kept moving money and weather and strangers through the dark. Inside, the room was warm enough. Mara turned off the hall light and left the door cracked. In the kitchen, her work laptop glowed with waiting emails, but none of them were on fire. Not tonight. She poured tea, sat by the window, and let the quiet settle around her. On the sill rested Bolt's old paper badge, forgotten after play. In the reflection of the glass she looked, still, like a tired woman in a soft gray sweater with her hair coming loose. Nothing in that image explained the systems she had built, the company she had steadied, the public apology she had received, or the million tiny calculations she carried every day without announcement. That was fine. The people who needed to know knew now. From the bedroom, half asleep, Ivy called once into the dark, "Mom, yes," a pause. Then, drowsy and certain, "Builders should get to rest too." Mara leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her mouth moved into something small, quiet, and unmistakably a smile. And the apartment held it there a little longer, just long enough to feel like home.